I want you to picture something. You're standing in your kitchen, making coffee, and you open a banking app you haven't checked in 3 weeks. And the number you see makes your hand go completely still. Not because it's low, because it's zero, and your name isn't on the account anymore. And you realize they did this together. I want you to stop whatever you're doing right now. Not slow down. Stop. Because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that, when it happened to me, made me put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and just stand there in the quiet, absolutely still, like the world had tilted 2 degrees to the left and no one had told me. I want you to picture something specific. You're in your kitchen. It's an ordinary Thursday evening. Nothing is wrong. Nothing feels off. You've made dinner, you've cleaned up, your husband is in the next room watching something on television, and you are standing at the counter scrolling through your phone the way you do every night, because that's just what evenings look like now. And then, for no particular reason, maybe because you remembered you meant to check something earlier, maybe just because your thumb moved without thinking, you open a banking app. And the number on the screen makes your hand go completely still. Not because it's low, because it's zero. And your name isn't on the account anymore. And you are standing in your kitchen. Your husband is 10 feet away. And you realize, not slowly, not in pieces, but all at once like a wall of cold water, that he did this. That they did this. That they have been doing this for 3 years. That's where this story begins. Stay with me, I promise you, every single minute of what I'm about to tell you is worth it. But before I go any further, if you're new here, my name is Claire, and I'm going to ask you to do 3 things right now before I continue. Not at the end. Right now. First, hit subscribe. Because this story has more layers than you're expecting, and I don't want you to miss a single one of them. Second, turn on notifications. Because after today, you are going to want to know every time I post. And third, drop a comment right now, before you even hear the rest. Just write the word found IT. 2 words. That's all. Because at the end of this video, I'm going to come back to the comments section, and if you wrote those words before you heard the ending, I want to know what you thought was coming. I want to see if anyone guesses right. Nobody ever guesses right? Okay. Let's go. My name is Claire Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and for almost 6 years, I was a wife who believed, genuinely, deeply, without question, that love meant trust, and trust meant you didn't check behind people you love. I was raised that way. My mother was a soft-spoken woman from a small town in Indiana, who had lived her whole life on the principle that suspicion was a form of cruelty. She used to say, and I can hear her voice right now as clearly as if she were in the room, she used to say, Claire, suspicious minds build lonely lives. She said it the way people say things that are supposed to end conversations. The kind of statement that sounds so complete, so true, so gently wise, that you just nod and absorb it and carry it with you for the next 20 years without ever once stopping to examine whether it was actually right. I carried it like a shield. Turns out it was just a blindfold. I grew up in a middle-class family in Columbus, Ohio. My dad was an accountant, which is almost funny now when I think about it, and my mother taught 2nd grade for 31 years. I have one older brother, Marcus, who lives in Denver with his wife and 2 kids and calls me every Sunday, and who was, for the record, the first person in my family to say, Claire, something's wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I was a good student. Focused, practical, not particularly dramatic. I got a degree in business management, landed a job at a logistics firm straight out of college, and spent the next 6 years building a career that was stable and quiet and mine. I liked my work. I was good at it. By the time I was 27, I was a project manager overseeing a team of 11, and I had figured out how to be the kind of person who could hold a lot of moving pieces in her head simultaneously, without dropping any of them. What I had not figured out, and this took me a long time to understand, was that being good at managing systems doesn't mean you're good at managing people. Systems follow rules. People, the wrong kind of people, follow strategies. And I didn't know the difference. Not yet. His name was Daniel Mercer. Danny. I want to describe him to you carefully, because the way I describe him matters. Because if I describe him as a villain, if I paint him with the colors he eventually earned, then this story becomes simple. And it wasn't simple. It started as something genuinely real, and the thing about people who do what Danny did is that they don't start as villains. They start as the most convincing version of a good person you have ever met. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in Chicago. I was 27. He was 31. He was sitting across the table from me, and he was not trying to impress anyone. That was the first thing I noticed. Every other person at that dinner was performing in some small way, talking a little louder than necessary, laughing a beat too early at jokes, but Danny was just there. Present. Comfortable. He asked the woman next to him about her job, and he actually listened to the answer. He listened in a way that made me realize how rare that is. How genuinely rare it is to sit across from someone and feel like your words are landing somewhere real. He had this habit, I noticed it immediately, of tilting his head very slightly to the left when someone was talking to him. Just barely. Just enough to say, I'm paying attention. I caught myself doing the same thing back to him by the end of the evening, and I didn't know I was doing it until Danielle, my college roommate who had come to the dinner with me, pointed it out on the drive home and said, "You were mirroring him all night." She said it like it was an observation. I said, "Was I?" She said, "It was kind of beautiful to watch." I fell for that head tilt before I fell for him. We got coffee the following week. Then dinner. Then more dinners. He was running a small commercial real estate brokerage with a business partner he'd known since college, and he talked about his work the way people talk about things they've actually thought about, not to impress, just to share. He drove a sensible sedan. He wore the same 3 blazers in rotation. He had a dying succulent on his kitchen windowsill that he kept meaning to either water properly or throw away, and somehow hadn't done either in 6 months, and when I teased him about it he said, "I keep thinking it might come back." And I thought, absurdly, disproportionately, this man is too hopeful to give up on a dying plant. What a wonderful quality. He talked about his grandmother, Eleanor, like she was his moral compass. He'd mention her in the middle of other conversations, almost involuntarily. Eleanor used to say, and whatever followed was always something simple and true and grounding. He'd learned to fix things from her. He'd learned to cook 3 things from her. He'd learned, he said, that dignity was the most important thing a person could protect, their own and other people's. I thought, this man is grounded. This man is safe. I was right about the grounded part. I was catastrophically wrong about the safe part. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. He did it on a Tuesday in October, not a holiday, not an anniversary, not a milestone of any kind. Just a regular Tuesday evening, when we'd finished dinner at home, pasta I'd made from a recipe his grandmother had written down on an index card, and he turned off the television and got down on one knee on our living room rug and looked up at me with the expression of a man who had never been more certain of anything in his life. No photographer hiding in the closet. No restaurant full of waiting friends. No string quartet in the corner. Just him and me and the quiet hum of the refrigerator and a ring that had belonged to his great-aunt Rosemary. A simple oval sapphire in a gold band that was old enough to have a warmth in it you can't manufacture. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I mean that literally. He got about halfway through what he'd planned to say, and I already had my hands on his face and was saying yes, 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 like a word I'd been waiting to say and hadn't known it. We got married the following June. Small ceremony. 40 people in a rented garden space on a warm Saturday afternoon. His vows were handwritten, and his voice broke twice, and the second time it broke I saw the efficient glance down to collect herself, and I thought, this is real. This is the most real thing that has ever happened to me. His mother stood in the front row. She was wearing white. I noticed. Of course I noticed. Every woman in that garden noticed. I caught 3 separate significant looks exchanged over champagne glasses during cocktail hour. Danny caught my eye at one point and gave me this tiny, apologetic, slightly mortified shrug. The shrug of a son who knows his mother is being his mother and can't do anything about it in this particular moment, and I loved him so much in that shrug that I actually laughed. A small, genuine, surprised laugh. And Sandra, Danny's mother, who was standing near enough to see me laugh, smiled at me. A warm smile. A smile that said, "We're going to be okay, you and I." I believed that smile. I believed everything for a long time. That was the last time I'll mention being naive, because I don't think naive is the right word. I think the right word is trusting. And I think trusting someone who has earned your trust, with evidence, over 14 months, is not a character flaw. It's what love asks of you. The crime wasn't mine. I need you to remember that. Now, before I tell you what was happening behind the scenes during those early years, I want to pause for 1 second. Because some of you, right now, already have a feeling. A little hum in your chest that says, something is very wrong here, and it started earlier than she realizes. You're right. It started before the wedding. I didn't know that yet. But someone in that garden that June afternoon already had a plan. And they were smiling the whole time. Keep watching. I need to take a breath before I talk about Sandra. Even now, 2 years removed from everything that happened, sitting in the house that has my name on it, drinking coffee on a porch that is mine. Even now, the sound of her name tightens something in my chest. Not with hate. I want to be precise about that. It's not hate. It's something more specific. It's the particular feeling of recognizing, too late, that something you thought was warmth was actually calculation. That you were being read and measured and assessed while you thought you were just having dinner. Sandra Mercer was 62 when Danny and I got married. She had been widowed for 8 years. Danny's father, Robert, had died of a heart attack at 59, a shock death, no warning, no time to prepare. Robert had been, by all accounts Danny gave me, a good man. Steady. Quiet. Reliable. He had handled everything. The finances, the investments, the insurance policies, the decisions about the house. Sandra had trusted him completely, the way my mother had taught me to trust, because that's what you do when you love someone. And when he died without warning, she had been left with a life she didn't know how to navigate alone. There was money, life insurance, some savings, the house, but the experience of being suddenly, violently financially responsible for herself had changed Sandra in ways that were not immediately visible. She had learned to manage. She had been forced to learn. And in the process of learning, she had decided, at some level that I don't think she was even fully conscious of, that her son would never be in the position of leaving a wife well-resourced if things went wrong. That if a marriage ended, the Mercer assets would stay Mercer. I didn't know any of this until much later. What I knew in the early years was that Sandra was gracious and warm and attentive and almost aggressively inclusive. She remembered my birthday. She brought food when I was sick. She told people at every family gathering that I was such a blessing to this family. And she said it with a warmth so genuine that I never once questioned it. She was, to be direct, a remarkable performer. Or, and I've sat with this interpretation for a long time, maybe the warmth was real. Maybe you can genuinely love someone and simultaneously work to protect yourself against them. Maybe both things were true at once, and that's what made it so hard to see. Sunday dinners had been Danny's tradition with his mother, started during the years he was living alone after his father passed. Every Sunday, just the two of them. When we got married, I joined. I didn't ask him to change the tradition. Why would I? Family dinners, close relationships with parents, Sunday rituals. These are good things. I wanted to be part of them. What I didn't notice at first was the shift. When it had been just Danny and Sandra, she was apparently relaxed and open. She would tell him everything, the small frustrations of her week, the gossip from her book club, her honest opinions on people she knew. When I joined, she became curated. She directed conversation toward me deliberately, asking about my work, my family, my opinions on things, my relationship with my own parents. She made me feel centered and seen. I thought she was being kind. She was gathering information. Specifically, she was learning how observant I was, how financially aware, how closely I paid attention to documents and numbers and structures. She was, over the course of those early Sunday dinners, building a picture of exactly how much she needed to worry about me. I found this out eventually, how she knew things, how she processed them, what she did with them. But first, I need to tell you what the first years of my marriage actually looked like from the inside, because that's where the machinery was built. The first year of our marriage was genuinely good. I am not going to rewrite history to make this a cleaner story. We were happy. Not performatively happy, privately happy. The kind of happiness that looks boring from the outside. Comfortable evenings, shared routines, inside jokes, the particular texture of a life that fits. We bought a house in the suburbs of Columbus 8 months after the wedding. A 4-bedroom colonial with a back porch that got afternoon sun from roughly 2 o'clock to 6, and I would sit out there on weekends with coffee and the newspaper and feel, in a way I hadn't felt since childhood, like my life had arrived somewhere solid. Like the ground under my feet was real. Danny's brokerage was growing. He'd brought on 2 new agents and was working on his first significant commercial deal, a strip mall acquisition on the east side that would, if it closed, represent a meaningful step up for him. I was stable in my own career, a project manager who had been given more responsibility and a raise she hadn't had to ask for. We had a joint account for household expenses, mortgage, utilities, groceries, the shared stuff of a shared life, and we each kept our own personal checking accounts for individual spending. It felt grown up and reasonable. We talked about money occasionally, not obsessively. Everything seemed clear. I did not know at the time that everything seems clear is exactly the condition under which certain kinds of damage are easiest to do. That when someone wants to rearrange your financial life without your awareness, they do it most effectively when you are content and trusting and not looking. The first official piece of the structure was built in month 4 of our marriage. I didn't know about it until year 4. In month 4, Danny opened a bank account at an institution across town, not our bank, not the bank his brokerage used, a different institution entirely, a regional bank with a perfectly ordinary name, in his name alone. Their initial deposit was modest, $11,000, transferred from the brokerage's operating account as what was described, in the brokerage records, as a management disbursement. Routine. His business partner signed off on it. His accountant noted it. It was, on paper, unremarkable. What made it remarkable was what it would become. In our second year, Danny started talking about restructuring some of our finances. He said his accountant, a man named Gerald, whom I had met once at a firm event, and who had the handshake of someone who had spent his entire career making people feel like they didn't need to ask too many questions. His accountant had recommended creating a holding structure for some of their real estate assets. Better liability protection. Tax advantages. Very standard for someone at Danny's level of business activity. He brought home paperwork one evening in February and set it on the kitchen table after dinner. A stack maybe a 1/4 inch thick. He poured himself a glass of water and sat down across from me and said, "Gerald's office put these together. It's basically just establishing the LLC structure we talked about, the tax thing. Just need your signature on a few places." I said, "Should I read all of this?" He said, "You can, babe. It's just standard stuff." Gerald went through it line by line with me, and it's exactly what I described. You'd basically just be signing to acknowledge that you're aware of the entity formation. I said, "Okay." And I signed. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because I know what you're thinking. And I know what you're feeling, if you've ever trusted someone completely and later wished you hadn't. I know the specific quality of the retrospective cringe, the way you replay the moment and insert the version of yourself who asks more questions, who reads more carefully, who says, "Let me take this to my own accountant first." But here's the thing I need you to hear. I had no reason at that point to do any of those things. I had been married to this man for slightly over a year. He had given me no reason to doubt him. The paperwork looked like paperwork. The explanation sounded like an explanation. The accountant had a firm with a real address and real clients. The document was not a forged instrument. It was a real legal document with real consequences, and some of those consequences were buried in language I didn't read. And what they said, in the plain English I would eventually find, was that I was waiving certain claims to assets held by the LLC in exchange for a nominal interest that had no actual value. I signed it in the kitchen, at our kitchen table, after dinner on a Tuesday in February, and then we watched television and went to bed. That's how it starts. Not dramatically. Not in the dark. At your own kitchen table, in the light after dinner. I need to stop here for just a second. Because right now, you're probably doing one of two things. Either you're sitting there thinking, I would have read every single word of that document, and maybe you would have, and maybe that's true, and I genuinely hope it is. Or you're sitting there thinking, oh no, I've signed things I didn't fully read. I've trusted someone that completely. And if that's you, if that's the feeling moving through you right now, I want you to stay with me. Because this story doesn't end in victimhood. I promise you. Stay with me. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, a friend, a sister, someone who's in a relationship that's given them that small quiet feeling that something isn't quite right, share this video with them right now. Before you forget. Before the feeling passes. Just send it. It might matter more than you know. Okay. We were in year 2. I had signed papers I didn't read. The house was still warm. The coffee was still good on the back porch. And something was being built, very carefully, very quietly, behind everything I could see. Let me keep going. In our 3rd year of marriage, I got pregnant. We had been trying for 8 months. 8 months that were, in ways I hadn't expected, quietly hard, not devastating, but tinged with a particular kind of hope that becomes fragile the longer it has to wait. Every month that passed put a small, almost invisible weight on things. Not enough to break anything. Just enough to feel. When the test came back positive, I was standing alone in the bathroom on a Sunday morning before Danny was awake. The window was cracked and there was a cold November wind coming through, and I was still in my pajamas, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. Not from sadness, from something so much larger than sadness that it had no available name. Something that felt like the world extending past its previous edges. Like a horizon moving outward. I went and woke Danny up. I didn't say anything. I just handed him the test and sat on the edge of the bed, and watched his face move through about 7 expressions in 4 seconds, and land, finally, on something that looked like joy so pure it was almost painful to see. He pulled me in and held on, and neither of us said anything for a long time. When we told Sandra, she wept. Openly, without self-consciousness. She held my face in both her hands and said, "My girl, my sweet, sweet girl." And she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as genuine. Real tears, real joy, real love. I believed every bit of it. I believe, even now, that in that moment it was real. That whatever else Sandra was, that moment of joy for her grandchild was not performance. But the miscarriage came at 11 weeks. I'm not going to spend a long time here. I'm telling you this not for sympathy. I've processed it, I've carried it. It lives in me in the way these things live in people, and I've made peace with that. I'm telling you because of what happened after. Because of what the grief created. Because what the grief created, in Danny, in Sandra, in the structure of our marriage, is central to everything that comes next. Danny went inward. That's the only way I can describe it. It was like a door in him closed, gently, without drama, and whatever was on the other side of it I couldn't reach. He was still present, still kind, still functional. He got up and went to work and made dinner and watched television and said "I love you" before bed. But there was a quality of absence underneath all of it, like a room with the lights on but no one home. I understood it. Grief does different things to different people, and I was not going to demand access to someone's pain. I gave him space. I gave him time. I believed, and this was not wrong, not entirely, that he needed to find his own way back. What I didn't know was that his mother was filling that space. In the months after the miscarriage, Sandra came over more. Significantly more. She started arriving on Sunday afternoons and still being there at 9 in the evening. She would be in the kitchen with Danny when I walked in from another room, and their voices, I noticed this at the time and told myself I was reading into it, their voices would shift when I appeared. Not stop. Shift. The register changed. Like a song that changes key mid-verse. I told myself they were processing together. A mother and son. Grief finds its own geography, and theirs was the kitchen, and who was I to put a border around that? What I understand now, what I can only see clearly from this distance, is that those months, those quiet grief-scattered months when I was giving Danny space and trusting Sandra's presence, and trying to put myself back together without burdening anyone, those were the months when the real work happened. The real architecture of what they were building. I wasn't imagining the shifted voices. I wasn't imagining the conversations that didn't resume when I walked in. I wasn't imagining any of it. But I wasn't going to know that for another year. And by then, it would be almost finished. It was a Thursday in October. Year 4 of my marriage. I need you to understand how completely ordinary this Thursday was. I had worked from home that day. I'd had 3 video calls and a deadline, and I'd eaten lunch at my desk. Danny was at the office. The house was quiet in the specific way houses are quiet in October. Windows closed, the particular muffled quality of late afternoon that comes when the air outside has gone cold and the inside hasn't caught up yet. We had gotten a notice from the gas company about a discrepancy on our account, not alarming, just administrative, the kind of thing that needed a paper statement to resolve. Danny kept paper records, which I knew and had never thought twice about. He was old-fashioned that way, organized in a physical sense that I'd always found slightly charming. Filing cabinets in the home office, labeled by category, perfectly sorted. I went into the home office. I found the correct cabinet. I opened the right drawer. I found the gas statements immediately. And behind the folder they were in, behind a folder of insurance documents at the very back of the drawer, I found something else. A folder I had never seen before. I almost didn't open it. I want to be honest about that. There was a version of this moment where I registered the unfamiliar folder, felt the small tug of curiosity, and then closed the drawer and took the gas statement to the kitchen and called the utility company and never looked. I looked. Inside the folder was a set of bank statements from an institution I had never heard of. Regional Bank. Account in Danny's name alone. I fanned the statements out. There were 8 months of them, the most recent dated 3 months prior, and I looked at the balance on that most recent statement. $212,000. I stood there in the home office for a very long time. I was counting things in my head. Our joint savings, approximately $40,000. Our individual retirement accounts combined, somewhere around $150,000, though I hadn't checked recently. Our equity in the house, we'd put down 20% and had been paying for 4 years, so perhaps $70,000 in equity. These were the numbers of our life. These were what comfortable but not wealthy looked like. $212,000 in a separate account, in his name alone, at a bank I had never heard of, that I had never known existed. I did the math and it didn't work. The math of our income, our expenses, our savings rate, it did not produce $212,000 in a hidden account. Which meant this money had to have come from somewhere. Had to have been built from something. Had to have been redirected away from something we shared. I put the statements back exactly as I'd found them. Exactly. I straightened the folder. I closed the drawer. I took the gas statements to the kitchen, called the utility company, and resolved the discrepancy. And then I sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't hear Danny's car in the driveway at 6:15 and go to pieces. I heard his car and I stood up and I started making dinner, and when he came in and said, "Hey, how was your day?" I said, "Good, busy, how was yours?" And he said fine and kissed me on the cheek, and poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table and talked about his afternoon. And I listened. And I nodded. And I put dinner on the table. And I did not say a single word about what I had found. Because the part of me that wanted to scream had gone very, very quiet. And another part of me, a part I hadn't met before, a part I didn't know I had, stepped to the front. Calm. Cold. Methodical. And that part said quietly to the rest of me, "Before you say anything, you need to know everything. Now, I need you to understand something about the next 6 weeks. The next 6 weeks are the part of this story that, when I tell it, people find hard to believe. They look at me and they say, 'How did you hold it? How did you sit across from him every evening and not say anything? How did you go to Sandra's Sunday dinner and pass the bread and ask about her week and not?' And I understand why they find it hard to believe. Because it's hard to explain from the inside. What I can tell you is this. I had a very clear understanding, by the end of those 45 minutes at the kitchen table, that if I moved too fast, I would lose. That they had years on me. That every advantage I had was in what they didn't know that I knew. And the moment I showed them that I knew, the moment I asked a question, made an accusation, showed any card at all, that advantage would be gone. I had one chance to do this right. I was going to take it. Stay with me. Because what I did next, what I built in those 6 weeks, is the part of this story that matters most. The first person I called was Danielle. Not because Danielle is an attorney. She is. She went on to become an estate attorney after law school. But because she is the person I have trusted most completely since I was 19 years old, which is how old we both were when we met as roommates freshman year of college. And she looked at my side of the room and said, "Your organizational system is making me feel calm, and I don't know how to feel about that." And I said, "That's the nicest thing anyone has said to me this semester." And we were friends from that moment forward. I called her the day after I found the statements. I did not call from my cell phone. I drove to a coffee shop 2 miles from our neighborhood, ordered something I don't remember, sat at a table in the back, and called her from the coffee shop's Wi-Fi on an app that didn't use my regular number. Was that paranoid? Yes. Was it necessary? I didn't know yet. But I had already learned, in those 45 minutes at the kitchen table, that the version of me who assumes things are fine is not the version of me I could afford to be anymore. I told Danielle, in careful and precise terms, what I had found. I told her about the statements, the amount, the fact that the account predated my awareness. I told her about the LLC paperwork I had signed in year 2. I told her about the refinancing, which I suddenly, with a new clarity that made me feel slightly sick, needed to look into much more carefully. Danielle listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, and then she said, "Okay, I'm going to give you a name, call him today, don't use your regular phone, don't email from your work account, and Claire, don't say anything to Danny yet, not one word." The name she gave me was Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 60 years old, gray-haired, with offices in a building downtown that smelled like old carpet and filing cabinets, and faintly, coffee. He had the quality that the best attorneys have, not impressive exactly, but immovable. Like he had heard every version of every bad situation, and had stopped being surprised by any of it 20 years ago, and was simply here now, in the business of getting to work. I sat across from him on a Tuesday during my lunch break. I had told my assistant I had a dentist appointment, and I laid out everything I knew. The statements, the LLC, the refinancing I hadn't yet verified but suspected, the timeline of the miscarriage period, the shift in Sandra and Danny's relationship, the Sunday dinners. He asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. When had the LLC been formed relative to our marriage? Had I received any documentation from the LLC since signing? Was my name listed anywhere on the entity as a member or beneficiary? What was the specific language of the refinancing? Had I signed a removal of co-borrower form or something else? I didn't know the answers to most of these questions. He told me to find out. He said, "Go home tonight and tomorrow and every day for the next few weeks and be completely normal. Give him no indication that anything has changed. And start quietly, carefully, building a record of everything you can access." I asked him what he thought we were dealing with. He looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "I think we're dealing with a long-term, coordinated effort to systematically separate you from assets you would otherwise be entitled to. And I think it's been going on longer than you know." I drove back to work. I ran a project kickoff meeting at 2:00. I ran it well. Marcus brought in a forensic accountant named Joyce Chen. I want to take a moment to tell you about Joyce because she deserves it. Joyce was 53, had short silver hair, and wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, the way people used to do before that became unfashionable, and then became fashionable again. She had the energy of a person who genuinely loved spreadsheets, not tolerates, not is good at, loves, in the way that people love things they were simply born to do. She found satisfaction in a clean audit trail, the way other people find it in a perfect meal or a long run. When she found an anomaly in a financial record, she would make a sound, just a small, quiet HM, that I came to recognize as the sound of her finding a thread she was about to pull. She pulled a lot of threads. Over 11 weeks, Marcus and Joyce and I built a picture. A complete picture. A picture with so many pieces that by the end of it, laid out across the conference table in Marcus's office, it covered the entire surface and overlapped onto the chairs. Here is what it showed. The LLC that I had signed papers for in year 2 of my marriage had been used, over the following 2 years, to receive revenue from 2 commercial properties that Danny's brokerage managed. These properties had been, during the courtship of our marriage, described to me as assets he was building toward. They had never been explicitly framed as jointly owned. Marriage complicates the ownership of premarital assets in complicated ways, but income generated during the marriage from any source is, under Ohio law, generally considered marital income. The LLC structure, and the language I had signed without reading, had been designed to reroute that income in a way that moved it away from our shared life, and into structures bearing only his name. The refinancing was worse. Removing a co-borrower from a mortgage requires the co-borrower's signature. I had apparently provided that signature. Marcus believed, based on the date of the refinancing paperwork, 9 weeks after our miscarriage. And on the volume of documents I'd signed in that general period, that the removal form had been inserted into a larger document stack during a time when I was both emotionally fragmented and operating entirely on trust. I did not remember signing it. I had no specific memory of any conversation about refinancing during that period. What I had a memory of was Danny saying, sometime in that winter, "I'm getting some paperwork sorted out," and me saying, "Okay," and meaning it because paperwork was always being sorted because that was just life. The secondary bank account, the $212,000, told the most complete story. Joyce traced its growth over 3.5 years through a series of transfers. Management disbursements from the brokerage, LLC profit distributions, proceeds from a property sale that had occurred in year 3 of our marriage, and that I had been told was a minor transaction, not worth much. The proceeds had been worth considerably more than nothing. When Joyce presented her summary, she did it the way she did everything, quietly, precisely, without drama. She set a single-page document in front of me and said, "This is the timeline. Every entry has a source document attached in the appendix." Then she folded her hands and waited. I read the timeline. I read it twice. And then I said, "How solid is this?" She said, "Solid enough." Marcus said, "Solid enough with the right framing. Not everything will hold up to challenge, but enough will." I said, "What's the strongest piece?" They looked at each other. And then Marcus opened a folder I hadn't seen before and set 3 printed pages in front of me. "These," he said, "are the strongest piece. I want to stop right here. Because what's in those 3 pages, what Marcus set down in front of me in that conference room at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, is the thing I did not see coming. The thing that made everything else make sense. The thing that answered the question I had been sitting with for weeks. Who built this? Who designed this? Who looked at the life I was building and said, she needs to have less than she thinks? I'll tell you in a minute. But first, if you have made it this far in this video, you are the kind of person who stays. Who pays attention. Who doesn't look away. And I want to acknowledge that, because this is not an easy story to sit with. If you're still here, leave a comment right now that says, "Still with you, Claire." Just those 4 words. I want to know how many of you are here. How many of you are listening? And then let me tell you what was in those pages. The emails had been found through a chain of events so unlikely that when Marcus explained it to me, I had to ask him to repeat it twice. Danny's business email had, at some point, Marcus believed it was a CC field error on a mobile device, sent a thread of emails to the wrong address. The recipient was a client of his brokerage, a woman in her late 70s named Ruth, who had been working with Danny's firm on a commercial lease for a small property she owned. Ruth had received the thread, recognized that it was clearly a private family correspondence, and had forwarded it back to Danny with a brief note. I believe this came to me in error. Danny had thanked her, had explained it was a misdirected personal email, had apologized for the confusion. Ruth, being a tidy and thorough woman, the kind, Marcus said, who has kept every receipt since 1987, had nonetheless saved the thread in her own email folder, filed under Danny Mercer, correspondence. She had not reread it. She had simply kept it, the way tidy people keep things, because discarding information feels like a small risk. When Marcus's office, during discovery preparation, sent requests to Danny's professional contacts asking for any business-related correspondence, Ruth had included the thread. Not because she was trying to help me, just because she was thorough. I read those emails sitting in Marcus's conference room. He had stepped out to give me space. The overhead light was fluorescent and slightly too bright, and the room smelled like old paper, and I read them twice, from beginning to end, in complete silence. They were not dramatic. That's the thing. They were not the emails of villains cackling over a plan. They were the emails of a woman who was afraid, and a son who trusted her, and the 2 of them building, carefully and incrementally, a structure they both believed was reasonable. The earliest one in the thread was dated 3 months after our wedding. Sandra to Danny. Daniel, I'm not saying she isn't lovely. She is. What I'm saying is that you've worked very hard for everything you have, and being married doesn't mean giving someone a claim to all of it automatically. Talk to Gerald about structures. There are ways to do this properly. I've spoken to Aunt Caroline's attorney about how Robert should have handled things, and I wish we'd known sooner. Danny's response, I know, I've been thinking about it. Gerald has some ideas. An email 18 months later. Sandra, the LLC paperwork. Has she signed everything? Gerald said to make sure the language is complete before the next property transaction. Danny, done. She signed it with the household documents in February. Didn't ask questions. An email following the miscarriage. Sandra, my heart breaks for both of you. Take care of her. But Danny, this would be the moment if you're going to do the property title adjustment. She'll be trusting you completely right now. I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. Do it now quietly and it's done. Danny, that feels wrong. Sandra, it is wrong and it's also necessary. Some things are both. Danny, 2 weeks later. Refinancing is scheduled for the 14th she signed. I set the pages down on the conference table. I looked at the wall for a while. The specific email that held me longest was Sandra's. It is wrong, and it's also necessary. Some things are both. Because there was something so perfectly clear about it. So honest in its way. She knew it was wrong. She said it was wrong. And she told her son to do it anyway, because the fear inside her was larger than the wrong, and she had found a way to name that and keep going. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I've decided it makes it both. Marcus came back into the conference room and sat across from me. He said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking about what I want." He waited. "I want the house," I said. "Whatever else we can recover, the assets, the income redirects, whatever Joyce can trace, I want what I'm entitled to and I'll fight for it. But the house, specifically, I want, not because of what it's worth, because it's mine. I picked it. I built a life in it. I'm not leaving it." Marcus nodded slowly. He said, "The house is the hardest fight. The refinancing, even with the constructive fraud argument, will be challenged aggressively." "I know," I said. "It may cost more to fight than the house is worth in equity." "I know. You still want it." "I want them to have to fight for it," I said. "I want them to know that I know. And I want them to find out that knowing doesn't mean what they thought it would mean." Marcus looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, let's build this properly." The following 3 weeks were preparation. Joyce finalized the asset documentation. Marcus prepared the filing. I did what I had been doing for 6 weeks. I went home. I made dinner. I passed the bread at Sandra's Sunday dinner. I laughed at the right moments. I asked about her book club. I was, to every external appearance, exactly the woman they had counted on me to be. On a Monday of the 4th week, I opened my own account at a new bank. I transferred my personal savings, money I had earned, money that had never commingled with Danny's, to that account. On a Tuesday, with Marcus's guidance and a careful review of Ohio law on marital assets under pending divorce proceedings, I transferred the balance of our joint household account to a temporary account in my name, accompanied by a legal notice to Danny's attorney that outlined the basis for the transfer and the pending action. On a Wednesday morning, I called a moving service, a small one, local, cash, and I moved my belongings out of the house while Danny was at work. Not everything. Just mine. My clothes, my books, my grandmother's china, my desk, the photograph of my parents from their anniversary dinner that had sat on my bedside table for 4 years. I left his things exactly as they were. I drove to Danielle's apartment. I called Marcus and said, "File it." He filed it. A courier delivered Danny's copy to his office at 3:45 that Wednesday afternoon. Danny called me 17 times that evening. I let every single call go to voicemail. I sat on Danielle's couch with a cup of tea and I listened to each voicemail in order, the way you read chapters of a book, one at a time, in sequence, and I let them tell me the story of his evening. The first 3 were confused. "Claire, what is this? What's happening? Call me back." The 4th was apologetic, a kind of reflex apology, the kind that happens before a person knows what they're actually apologizing for. The 5th through 8th were a kind of escalating panic, the sound of a man going through paperwork and beginning to understand the scope of what Marcus had filed. The 9th was angry, a contained, tight anger, the kind that sits behind closed teeth. The 10th through 14th cycled back through confusion and bargaining. "Can we talk about this? There are things you don't understand. Please just call me." The 15th was quiet. He said, "Claire, I've read everything. I know what you found, I know what you know, and I need you to know that I know this is not fixable. I know that, I don't know when it went so far, I can't explain the thinking. I can't make it make sense because it doesn't make sense. I think I told myself it was protection, that I was protecting what I'd built, but it wasn't about that, not really. I think I was afraid." And my mother. A long pause. My mother made it feel reasonable. For a long time she made it feel like the reasonable thing to do, and I let her, and I should never have let her, and I'm sorry, I know that's not enough. I don't have anything that's enough, I'm just sorry. I listened to that one 3 times. Not because it changed anything. It didn't change anything. But because it answered a question I'd had since October. Not was he complicit, yes, obviously, demonstrably yes. But did he know, fully, consciously, what he was doing the whole time? And the answer was, I think he knew and found a way not to know simultaneously, because his mother was very good at giving him permission to look away. The 16th and 17th were short. His attorney's name. A request to have Marcus contact them directly. The 18th call, which came the next morning at 8:47, while I was drinking coffee at Danielle's kitchen table, was from Sandra. I answered. She said, Claire. And then nothing for a moment. Then, I think we should talk about this reasonably. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. And I thought, even now. Even at the end of everything, she goes to gracious first. It's the only move she knows. I said, Sandra, I have the emails. A silence. Long and specific. The silence of someone reconsidering their entire posture. I said, I have the email where you told Danny that the timing of our miscarriage was the right moment to move on the property title, because I'd be trusting him completely. I have that email specifically. She didn't say anything. I want you to know, I said, that I don't hate you. I've thought about it a great deal. I genuinely don't. I think you were afraid. I think losing Robert the way you lost him left you with a fear so large that you built an entire structure around protecting your son from its consequences. And I think somewhere in that structure you stopped being able to see me as a person and started seeing me as a variable to manage. And I think that's a tragedy. Honestly, for both of us. She said, Claire. I'm not finished, I said. And she stopped. I think you loved me as much as you were capable of loving someone you were also working against. I think Sunday dinners were real. I think you held my face in your hands in the kitchen when I was pregnant and you felt something true. And I think those things can all be true at the same time as what you did. The heart is big enough to hold contradictions. I'm not responsible for sorting yours out. I paused. Have a good day, Sandra, I said. And I ended the call. And I finished my coffee. The divorce took 14 months. I want to be honest about that. It was not clean, it was not quick, and there were weeks when it was genuinely brutal. Danny's attorneys were good, not brilliant, but thorough and aggressive, and they pushed back on every claim with the focused energy of people being paid to push back. The LLC arguments were contested line by line. The constructive fraud claim on the refinancing documents was challenged on multiple grounds. The forensic accounting was disputed. Joyce counter-disputed. Marcus counter-filed. I had a lot of Tuesday afternoons in conference rooms looking at documents and trying to understand what they meant. There were weeks when I couldn't feel anything about it, when the whole thing had reduced itself to paperwork and procedure, and I was just a person processing a process. There were weeks when it came back to feeling, and those were harder. Not because I doubted, I never doubted, but because grief is grief, and I had loved Danny, and somewhere under the anger and the calculations and the legal filings, that love had to be grieved too. I grieved it quietly, mostly alone. Sometimes on the phone with my brother Marcus in Denver, who had said something's wrong before any of this began, and who now said, simply and consistently, every Sunday when we talked, "You're doing the right thing, keep going." I kept going. The thing that held us together, that held the case together, was the emails. They were the one thing Danny's attorneys couldn't fully neutralize. They could dispute accounting methodologies and question signature authenticity and challenge property law interpretations. But there was no legal framework for making Sandra's email about the miscarriage look like something other than what it was. It was too specific, too timed, too explicitly aware of its own wrongness. It is wrong, and it's also necessary. You can't spin that sentence into something else. The settlement was reached 4 months before a scheduled trial date. Both sides were exhausted. The costs were mounting for both of us. The email evidence had shifted the leverage enough that Danny's attorneys eventually advised a deal. I won't give you exact numbers. Not because I'm withholding, but because the numbers were genuinely never the point for me. What the settlement gave me was this. The house. My house. The 4-bedroom colonial with the back porch that gets afternoon sun from 2 o'clock to 6. My name on the deed, alone, clearly in clean black ink. It was the fight they fought hardest, and the thing I wanted most, and we won it. Marcus and Joyce and I together, we won it. I also received a structured settlement on the financial claims Joyce had documented, a portion of the LLC assets traceable to marital income, and full coverage of legal costs. Danny retained the secondary account, reduced, and certain business assets. His mother retained nothing from the proceedings, because she had nothing in her name to retain. What she retained was a son who had lost significantly more than either of them had planned for, partly because her roadmap had led him there. I do not know what their relationship looks like now. I don't need to know. 11 days after the settlement finalized, I moved back into my house. I want to be careful about how I tell this part because it matters. Because it's not triumphant, exactly. Triumph implies that winning was the point, and it wasn't. The point was never winning. The point was standing in what was real. I drove there in the early evening, November, the light going sideways through bare trees. I had the key in my hand, my key, the one I'd had made when we first bought the house, and I stood on the front porch for a moment before I unlocked the door. The porch boards had been painted the year before, a soft gray that I had picked out on a Saturday morning with a paint chip and a lot of consideration, and they still looked good. I noticed that. I stood there, and I noticed that the paint still looked good. Inside, the house had the particular smell of a house that has been unoccupied for a while. Slightly closed, slightly cool, the smell of air that has had time to settle. I walked through the first floor slowly. The kitchen, where I had made dinner 100 times, and said nothing 100 times. The living room, where Danny had proposed on a Tuesday evening with his gray tance ring. The home office with the filing cabinet that I now knew I should have opened on any of the many other days I'd passed it. I didn't linger in those rooms. I went to the back of the house, and I opened the back door, and I stepped onto the porch. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, and the sun was doing what it always did, coming sideways through the trees at that particular November angle, the light going amber and long, laying itself across the porch boards in the way I had sat and watched it do every weekend for 4 years. The coffee I had made at Danielle's was in a thermos in my bag, and I poured a cup and I sat down in the chair that had always been mine, right side, facing the yard, and I held the cup in both hands and I watched the light. I thought about all the versions of myself that had sat in that chair. The one who thought she had arrived somewhere solid. The one who stood at the file drawer in October with her hand going still. The one who drove to a coffee shop to make a phone call from an app that didn't use her regular number. The one who sat in Marcus's conference room reading emails that said things like, "It is wrong, and it's also necessary." The one who said, "File it into a phone," and meant every syllable. I thought about my mother's voice, "Suspicious minds build lonely lives." I thought with tenderness and with grief, "Mom, you weren't wrong about everything. But you were wrong about that. A suspicious mind didn't cost me my life. An unsuspecting one nearly cost me everything. What I had now, this house, this porch, this light, this quiet that belonged only to me, hadn't come from trust. It had come from seeing clearly. From being willing to look at what was real, instead of what I needed to be real. From finding out that I could hold a great deal of difficulty without dropping it. From finding out, in other words, who I actually was. The light moved across the porch. I drank my coffee. The yard was slightly overgrown. I'd need to deal with that in the spring. And the flower bed along the fence had gone fully brown, and the bird bath in the corner had filled with dead leaves, and none of it mattered at all. It was mine. All of it, exactly as imperfect as it was mine. I've been back in this house for almost 2 years. I want to use this last part of the story to say some things that I've needed a long time to know how to say. Not advice exactly. I'm not a therapist. I'm not an attorney. I'm not in a position to tell anyone what their situation means or what they should do about it. Just things I know now that I wish I'd known before. Things that feel important enough to say out loud. The first thing is this: love and safety are not the same thing. I grew up believing, without being taught this explicitly, just absorbing it from the air, from my mother's voice, from the culture of trust because you love, that if you truly love someone, they are therefore safe. That love is evidence of good intentions. That the intensity of the feeling is a measure of the reliability of the person. This is not true. It can be true. But it is not automatically, necessarily, inherently true. You can love someone completely, with total sincerity, and still be harmed by them. Their love for you can also be real and still not protect you. These things coexist in the world, and I wish someone had said that to me at 25. The second thing, patience is not the same as passivity. When I tell people about the 6 weeks between finding those bank statements and filing for divorce, the reaction I most often get is something like awe or unease, like holding all of that quietly, moving strategically rather than reactively, was either impressive or slightly frightening. I understand both reactions. But what I want to say is, waiting was not the same as doing nothing. I was doing something every single day. I was gathering information. I was protecting what I could protect. I was making choices about when and how to act rather than letting my emotions choose for me. That is not coldness. It is not manipulation. It is the decision to be effective rather than immediately expressive. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to be strategic on your own behalf. The third thing, and this one took me the longest, being deceived is not the same as being stupid. I signed documents I didn't read. I trusted explanations I should have verified. I gave my husband access to structures that were used against me. I did all of that. And I spent a long time, more time than I'd like to admit, sitting with the question of whether that made me foolish. Whether I should have known. Whether a smarter woman, a more suspicious woman, a different woman would have seen it coming. And eventually I reached an answer. Not a comfortable answer, but a true one. I was a person who loved her husband. I was a person who had been given 14 months of consistent, patient, genuine evidence that he was trustworthy before she married him. I was a person operating in a life that felt real and good and solid, because most of it was real and good and solid. The warmth wasn't entirely manufactured, the love wasn't entirely fake, the Sunday dinners weren't entirely performance. The deception was built inside something real. That's why it worked. And that's not a character flaw in me. That's a testimony to how sophisticated it was. I was not stupid. I was trusting. And I was trusting someone who had, for a long time, genuinely earned it. Until, at some point, his mother's fear became louder than his conscience, and he made choices that cannot be explained away. The line between those two things, earning trust and then betraying it, is real. It matters. I refuse to collapse it into something that was only ever my failure to see. The fourth thing, you can understand someone and still hold them accountable. I understand Sandra. Not completely. I'll never fully understand the interior of another person's fear. But I understand the shape of it. I understand a woman who lost control of her financial life in an instant and decided, from that moment forward, to control what she could. I understand a mother who looked at her son's wife and calculated risk. I understand someone who built something she told herself was love and protection, but was actually, at its core, fear with better manners. I understand all of that. And I still filed. And I still fought. And I still won. Understanding is not the same as forgiveness. And forgiveness is not the same as absolution. And absolution is not something I'm in the business of distributing. What I am in the business of is living well. In my house, on my porch, in my life. The fifth and final thing, the thing I come back to most often when I'm sitting on that porch with my coffee and the afternoon light is doing what it does. You find out who you are in the moments when it matters most. I found out that I am someone who holds her composure under conditions that would break a lot of people. I found out that I am someone who can sit across from a person who has harmed her and smile and pass the bread and ask about their week, and do it not from weakness but from absolute clarity of purpose. I found out that I can make a phone call from an app that doesn't use my regular number, and hire a forensic accountant, and read 3 pages of devastating emails in a fluorescent-lit conference room at 7 in the evening, and drive home, and make dinner, and do it all again the next day. I found out that I am, when the situation demands it, exactly enough. That is what this story cost me, and what it gave me, and I would not trade the giving for the taking back of the cost, because the person I was before did not know those things, and the person I am now does. That's worth something. That's worth quite a lot. I'm going to sit here on this porch for a little while longer. But before I go, before you click away and go back to your day, I want to ask you something. And I want you to really answer it. In the comments, not just in your head. What would you have done differently? I'm asking genuinely. Not as a challenge, not as a could you have handled this better than me question. I've been asked that and it's the wrong question. I'm asking, if you had been standing at that file drawer, holding those bank statements, feeling your hand go still, what would the next 5 minutes have looked like for you? Would you have confronted him immediately? Would you have called your mother? Would you have called a lawyer? Would you have put the statements back and decided you'd imagine something and never looked again? There's no wrong answer. I'm just curious. Because the version of me who stood in that home office that Thursday could have gone in 100 different directions. And I think about those directions sometimes. The ones I didn't take. The ones that would have led to something different. Tell me in the comments. Scroll down right now and tell me. And if this story hit you somewhere, if something in here resonated, if some part of this felt familiar, if you watched this and thought of someone in your life who might need to hear it, share it. That's all I'm asking. Not for me. For them. Send it to the person you thought of. It might matter more than you know. If you're new here and you made it to the end of this video, first of all, welcome. Second of all, I genuinely appreciate you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one. I post when I have something worth saying, and I try to only do it when I have something worth saying. And for everyone who was here from the beginning, who wrote found IT in the comments before they heard the ending, go check your comment now. And then tell me, did you guess right? Nobody ever guesses right. But I love that you try. Take care of yourselves. My name is Claire. The house is mine. That's enough. There were things, looking back, that I should have noticed. Not because I was supposed to be a detective. Not because love requires constant vigilance, or because healthy relationships demand that you audit your partner's behavior for signs of deception. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there are patterns, when I look back now with clear eyes, that were there, genuinely, objectively there, and that I interpreted generously when I should have at least noticed them as questions. I want to tell you about them, specifically, because I think this is the part of stories like mine that actually helps people. Not the dramatic revelation. Not the confrontation. Not the winning. The small, quiet, easy-to-explain away things that accumulate, over years, into something you should have asked about. The first was Gerald, the accountant. I had met Gerald once, at a firm event Danny invited me to, early in our marriage, the kind of stiff corporate cocktail hour where everyone stands in clusters and talks about things that don't particularly matter. Gerald was in his late 50s, wire-framed glasses, handshake that told you he'd done it 10,000 times before. We spoke for maybe 6 minutes. He asked about my work in a way that was polite but incurious. He answered 2 questions I asked about his practice in ways that were technically complete, but gave me nothing. And he had a habit, I noticed it even then, even before I had any reason to care, of pausing before he answered. Not a thoughtful pause. A calculating one. The pause of a person deciding what to tell you rather than simply telling you. I thought at the time, accountants are careful people by nature. That's fine. What I didn't do was make any independent effort to understand the financial structures Gerald was creating. I attended no meetings with him directly. I received no independent communication from his office. Everything was mediated through Danny. Gerald says, Gerald recommends, Gerald's office sent over these forms, and I accepted that mediation without questioning it. This was, in retrospect, a structural vulnerability. Not because every couple needs their own separate accountant, but because any financial structure that exists in your life should be one you understand directly, not through a translator. The second thing was the Sunday dinners, and specifically something Sandra did that I noticed and then unnoticed almost immediately. In the first year and a half of those dinners, Sandra asked me a lot of questions about money. Not obviously. Not in a way that would register as an interrogation. She wove it in, she'd ask about my job, and from my job she'd ask about whether the company was doing well. And from whether the company was doing well, she'd ask whether I thought about financial security differently than my parents had. And from there she'd ask something specific about our household setup. Did we do everything jointly, or did we each keep our own things? Did I like having separate accounts, or did I find that complicated? Did I have investments of my own, or did I tend to think of it as a combined picture? I answered these questions openly, genuinely, because I had nothing to hide, and because they felt like a mother-in-law getting to know her daughter-in-law's values and priorities, which is a normal thing for a mother-in-law to do. What she was actually doing was mapping my financial awareness, determining how closely I tracked our shared assets, understanding whether I was the type of person who would notice discrepancies, and if so, how quickly. After about 18 months, she stopped asking those questions. I thought at the time, we've gotten past the getting to know you stage. She knows me well enough now that she doesn't need to ask. What I understand now is that she had the information she needed. She had determined that I was financially present, but not obsessive. That I knew the broad outlines of our situation, but didn't audit the details. That I was trusting in a specific, patterned, predictable way. And she had communicated that assessment to her son and his accountant and whoever else was involved in the structure they were building. The third thing, and this is the smallest one, the one that I almost left out because it seems so minor in the context of everything else, was a comment Danny made in our third year, a throwaway thing said at dinner on a Wednesday, that I thought about once and then set down and forgot entirely until after the divorce, when it came back to me with a clarity that was almost physical. We were talking about a couple we knew, friends of friends who were going through a contentious divorce, the kind that involves lawyers and asset disputes and property fights that drag on for years. I was saying something about how sad it was, how people who once loved each other could end up treating each other that way. And Danny said, not unkindly, almost philosophically, I think people always underestimate how important it is to protect yourself in a marriage, not against the person, you're not protecting against them, but just structurally. You know, the legal structures. People think love is enough and it never is. I said something agreeable. I thought it was just a somewhat cynical take on marriage and divorce, the kind of thing people say when a divorce is in the news. He wasn't talking philosophically. He was telling me, in the language of a general observation, something true about his own specific situation. He was saying, I am doing this. I believe it is reasonable. I have framed it to myself in language that makes it seem protective rather than harmful. I didn't know that then. I know it now. And when I think about that conversation, that Wednesday dinner in year 3, I don't feel the specific anger I feel when I think about the emails. I feel something sadder. Because I think in that moment Danny was, at some level, trying to tell me something. Trying to see if I'd react. Trying to gauge, maybe, whether there was a version of this where he could be honest with me without losing everything. And I gave him nothing, not because I was strategic, but because I genuinely didn't understand what I was being told. I gave him a nod and a sympathetic comment, and passed him more pasta. And he decided, I think, that the moment had passed. And so it went on. I want to go back to the pregnancy, and to the miscarriage, because I didn't say everything I needed to say the first time. The grief was not simple. I want to say that plainly, because grief for a pregnancy is a specific and complicated kind of grief that doesn't always get to be named in full. It's a grief for something that existed in potential, for a person who was becoming, who was 11 weeks into becoming, who had a heartbeat I had heard at 9 weeks in a gray-lit ultrasound room, and who was, as of the following Tuesday, gone. You grieve the person. You grieve the version of yourself that was going to be that person's mother. You grieve the future, which had been specific and detailed in your imagination, and is now, suddenly, unspecified again. You grieve the version of your marriage that was going to contain a child, which is a different marriage than the one that exists without one. Danny and I never talked about it the way I needed to talk about it. I don't think he was withholding. I think he was struggling in his own way and didn't have language for it, and, like many men I have known, defaulted to silence when silence was the wrong default. We talked around it. We were kind to each other about it. But we never sat together in the actual center of it and said, this is what I lost, this is what I'm carrying, this is where I am. And Sandra filled that gap. With Danny, not with me. I understand, in retrospect, that what she offered him was permission. Permission to grieve privately, to keep it contained, to not show me his pain. Maybe because she believed showing me would be burden, or maybe because she wanted to be the person he showed it to, or maybe simply because the closeness that pain creates is addictive in a way that requires no malicious intent to be harmful. She became, in those months, more important to him than I was. And I let that happen because I thought it was grief processing, and because I didn't want to compete with a mother for her grieving son. What I wish I had done, and this is not a should have, it's a wish I had, which is a different and kinder thing. What I wish I had done is said to Danny, somewhere in those winter months, come back to me. Not back from Sandra. Just back to me, I need you here. I'm grieving too and I need you to be present in our grief together and not disappear into yours separately. I didn't say that. Partly because I was trying to give him space. Partly because I was myself, trying to be strong in the particular way that people who were raised to be strong try to be strong, which is to say, alone and quietly, so as not to be a burden. We were both doing the wrong thing. Separately. While Sandra filled the gap between us. And in that gap, work got done. I'm not blaming the miscarriage for the betrayal. The betrayal would have happened anyway. The groundwork was laid before the pregnancy, and Sandra's emails make clear that the plan was in motion from early in our marriage. But the miscarriage accelerated it. The grief gave them cover. My vulnerability gave them access. The period when I most needed Danny to be present was the period when he was most fully elsewhere. That's a specific kind of loss, on top of the loss of the pregnancy itself. I've sat with it for 2 years. I don't know that I'm entirely done sitting with it, but I'm still here. And the light still comes through the trees at 4:30. And the coffee is still good. And I'm still here. I want to tell you about a specific afternoon with Joyce, because it contains something I've thought about many times since, and I think it's worth saying. We were going through a particular set of brokerage records, property management fees over a 30-month period, looking for evidence of income diversion into the LLC rather than into jointly accessible accounts. It was painstaking work. Column by column, month by month, comparing declared income to actual deposits, tracing the delta between what was earned and what appeared in accounts with my name anywhere on them. Joyce had spread the records across her desk and was moving through them with a fine-tipped pen, making small marks as she went. I was sitting across from her following, along with my own copy. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November, gray outside, the kind of day that smells like old rain, and the fluorescent light in Joyce's office made everything look slightly flatter than it was. At some point I looked up from the spreadsheet and I said, Joyce, how do people do this? How do they sit across from someone at dinner every night and... She looked up, took off her reading glasses, and she said something I've repeated to myself many times since. She said, they don't think of it as doing something to you. They think of it as doing something for themselves. The moment you're reframed in someone's mind as an obstacle rather than a person, or as a risk rather than a partner, the behavior that follows doesn't feel like betrayal from the inside. It feels like management, like problem solving. People are extraordinarily good at building narratives that make their choices feel reasonable. I thought about that. I said, and the person it's happening to, do they ever feel it, even if they can't name it? Joyce put her glasses back on. She said, almost always they feel something. They usually just decide to explain it away. I thought about the Sunday dinners. The shifted voices. Danny's philosophical comment about protecting yourself in marriage. The pause in Gerald's handshake. I had felt something. I had explained it all away. How do you stop doing that? I asked. Joyce looked at me over her glasses. She said, you're already doing it. And she went back to the spreadsheet. That was the moment, I think, when I understood that what I had found at the file drawer in October, and everything I'd done since, wasn't just about the money or the house or the legal outcome. It was about the choice to stop explaining things away. To look directly at what was real, even when real was harder than the explanation. It is harder. It is also the only place from which you can actually build anything. I want to give Marcus Webb a proper moment in this story, because he deserves it and because he is, in a real sense, one of the reasons this story ends the way it does. Marcus Webb was not a warm man in the way people usually mean warm. He didn't offer reassurances. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. When I asked him, in our second meeting, what he thought the realistic outcome was, he gave me a number and a range and a list of risks without any attempt to soften them. He said things like, this argument is strong, and this argument is weaker than we'd like, and I want you to understand that this scenario is possible, without cushioning any of it. And that was exactly what I needed. Because I had been surrounded, for the years of my marriage, by comfortable softening. By it's just standard stuff, and Gerald went through it line by line, and don't worry about the details. I had been managed for years by people who knew that the way to keep me from looking too closely was to give me just enough of an explanation to satisfy the part of me that wanted to trust. And I had accepted it because the softening felt like care. Marcus's directness felt, at first, almost brutal. And then it felt like the most respectful thing anyone had done for me in years. He treated me, from the first meeting, as a person who was capable of handling accurate information. He did not assume I needed protection from the truth of my own situation. He did not tell me what he thought I wanted to hear. He told me what was real, and he told me what we could do about it, and he let me make my own decisions from there. There's a particular moment, I think it was our 5th or 6th meeting, sometime in late November, when I walked into his office directly from my workplace, in my work clothes, having just finished a project meeting that had run long, carrying a paper coffee cup that had gone cold an hour before. And Marcus looked at me and said, "You look like you're holding a lot." I said, "I'm fine." He said, "I know you are. I'm observing, not questioning." And something about that, the distinction he drew, without being asked to draw it between observation and doubt, made me sit down and drink the cold coffee and say, I'm tired. I'm tired of being both versions of myself simultaneously. The person at work who has everything together and the person in this conference room who is dismantling her marriage. He said, "You don't have to be that tired for much longer." He said it matter-of-factly, not as consolation, as a statement of the projected timeline. And somehow that was better than sympathy. I've thought about Marcus Webb a lot in the 2 years since the settlement. About what it means to have the right person in the right role at the right moment. About how different this might have gone with a different attorney. One more comfortable with mediated settlements, or less willing to push on the constructive fraud argument, or less thorough in the discovery process. Sometimes the outcome of the most important things in your life depends on who happens to be sitting across from you on a Tuesday afternoon. That's not comfortable, but it's true. I got lucky with Marcus Webb, and I am conscious of that luck and grateful for it in a way that has nothing to do with complacency. The winter was quiet. I had the house, and I moved back into it, and the first weeks were an exercise in reacquainting myself with the specific language of a space that had meant many things at many times. I relearned the way the radiator in the second bedroom clicked twice before it came on. I relearned which stair creaked and where to step to avoid it. I relearned the quality of morning light in the kitchen in December. Thin, almost apologetic, coming in at a low angle through the east-facing window, and landing on the tile floor in a narrow rectangle that moved across the room as the morning progressed. I was, for the first time in many years, alone in the way that is entirely voluntary. Alone not because someone had left, or because something had broken, but because I had chosen a particular kind of space and was now inhabiting it on purpose. It was strange, and then it was good, and then it became simply ordinary, which is what good things become when they are consistent enough. Ordinary. The good ordinary. The kind you don't notice in the moment, but that you will look back on, from some distance, as the texture of a period when you were quietly, sustainably, genuinely all right. My brother Marcus called every Sunday, as he always had. My mother called on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we talked about small things, her garden, a book she was reading, whether I'd eaten properly, and sometimes she would pause in the middle of a conversation and say, very carefully, "I've been thinking about what I used to say, about suspicious minds." And I would say, "Mom, you didn't know." And she would say, "No, but still." And I would say, "I know." And we would both mean it, and then we would talk about something else, because some things are said fully in a few words and don't need more. Danny L. came to stay for a long weekend in February. We sat on the back porch in coats and drank hot wine, and she told me about a case she was working on, and I told her about a project at work that was consuming too much of my attention. And we didn't talk about Danny or Sandra at all, and it was one of the best weekends I had in a very long time. Spring came. The flower bed along the back fence, which had gone fully brown in November and which I had flagged for attention in the spring, turned out to have a daffodil problem. Not a problem exactly, more of an abundance. Whoever had planted bulbs in that bed before us, before Danny and I bought the house, had planted with enthusiasm. In March, yellow came up everywhere. More than I expected. More than the space had seemed to have room for. I stood at the back door on the morning they first appeared and looked at them for a long time. I'm not a person who attaches great significance to flowers as symbols. I don't want to tell you this was a moment of transcendent meaning. It was just a Tuesday morning, and I was in my pajamas, and the coffee hadn't finished brewing yet, and there were more daffodils than I expected. But I stood there for a while. And I thought the person who planted those did not know me. Did not know who would live here after them, who would stand at this door on this morning, what that person would have been through. They just planted bulbs in the fall because bulbs in the fall make daffodils in the spring. And they did not need to know who would be standing here to know that the daffodils were worth planting. I thought about that. I made my coffee. I took it to the back porch. The morning was cold and clear, and the daffodils moved slightly in the wind, and everything was extremely, quietly, specifically fine. I've talked for a long time today. If you made it this far, to the daffodils, to the end, to this particular sentence, then I want to take a moment and say something directly to you. You stayed. Not everyone stays. Most people with something this long click away somewhere in the middle when they get the general shape of the story and think they've understood it. You didn't. You're here at the end. And that tells me something about you. It tells me you're the kind of person who pays attention, who stays with things, who believes that the whole of a story matters, not just the dramatic parts. And I want to say, that quality, that staying quality, is also what got me through this. The willingness to stay in something hard without looking away. To sit with Marcus Webb in a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon and read documents and not leave. To stay at my own kitchen table after October and be calm and keep going. Staying, when staying is hard, is not passive. It is one of the most active things a person can do. So thank you for staying. Now, 3 things before you go. 1. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. Not because I'm asking for numbers. Because I only post when I have something worth saying, and if you want to be here when I do, subscribing is the only way to make sure you're not one of the people who misses it. 2. Share this. Right now, before you close the app. Think of one person, just one, who needs to hear something in this story. Not the betrayal part, not the revenge part. Think about which part they need. Is it the part about love and safety, not being the same thing? Is it the part about being patient rather than reactive? Is it the part about not confusing trust with self-erasure? Think about which part is for them and send it to them. You don't even have to explain why. Just send it. 3. Go down to the comments right now and tell me what part stayed with you. Not what surprised you. What stayed. What's still in you right now. I read them. I read all of them. Not immediately, not every hour, but I read them. And the ones that hit me hardest are always the ones that say, this part, this specific part, this is where it landed. Tell me where it landed. My name is Claire. The house is mine. The daffodils come up every spring. Take care of yourselves out there. I'll see you next time.